Good morning, and welcome to the Global Energy Institute's EnergyInnovates series. GEI has focused for years on the critical role of innovation in meeting the global climate challenge, and we were particularly proud to play a leading role in seeing the Energy Act of 2020 signed into law. The most important climate and energy legislation in over a decade, the bill included dozens of bipartisan proposals to promote R&D among a broad array of technologies that can all be part of the long-term solution. Now we must be sure we don't miss this opportunity. This series will discuss the innovation that's driving America's energy future. Future sessions will highlight the projects, policies, and technologies that are shaping our energy landscape and are laying the foundation to solve global challenges. Today's first session will take a high-level view of funding our energy future, where we will examine the implementation of the Energy Act and its importance to the development of breakthrough technologies that are critical to meeting emissions reductions goals, not only of President Biden, but of governments at all levels here in the US and around the world, as well as a growing number of businesses. And while we didn't plan it this way, our discussion is very timely, given President Biden's announcement of the American Jobs Plan. There's too much to unpack there, but it clearly acknowledges the need to fund research and development. To kick off our event, I'm pleased and honored to be joined by Congresswoman Leslie Fletcher from the 7th District of Texas. She represents much of Houston and captures the energy corridor of Texas, of her state. So Congresswoman Fletcher sits on both the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committees, right at the intersection of energy policy and innovation. Co-chair of the Natural Gas Caucus, a member of the Oil and Gas Caucus, she was a vocal advocate for the Energy Act of 2020 and is a constructive and valuable voice in energy policy. Congresswoman Fletcher, thank you for joining us today, and let me invite you to tell us a bit about your district and your outlook on these important topics.
Well, thanks so much, Marty, for inviting me and having me here this morning. I'm glad to be with you and really glad to be talking this morning about these issues. They are essential to my district, and it's what we do here. It was a big part of my pitch in trying to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee, is reminding everyone that Houston is the energy capital of the world, and the work that we're doing here is absolutely going to lead us into the future. And a lot of what we were able to authorize in the Energy Act of 2020 will be absolutely essential both for my community and for people around the world in terms of developing the technologies we need and the work ahead. So very excited to be with you this morning and look forward to our visit.
Wonderful. Well, again, we want to thank you for being such a leader on energy issues, including urging President Biden to reconsider some of the early actions he took with regard to federal leasing on, energy leasing on federal lands. So I have a few questions that I want to ask you, but I do want to invite the audience as well. If you have a question for Representative Fletcher, please submit it in the chat function, and we'll manage that in the back room here. So as you noted, your district is the heartland of America's energy and industrial economy. So what do you see as the opportunities and the challenges for that region to fit into our nation's energy future? And in specific, how will the oil and gas sector be part of the solution, particularly as it relates to CCUS and carbon removal?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ground to cover there, but I think you're right. You said, there are challenges and opportunities, and I think that's exactly right. In our community, we see challenges as opportunities. It's kind of in our DNA. And we put a man on the moon, right? We built the first domed stadium here that everyone else enjoys now around the country, and we've provided energy to the world for decades and decades. So when it comes to our energy future, there's simply no other city in the world that has the expertise and the know-how and the concentration of thought leaders and researchers, engineers, and the whole ecosystem to really lead us into the future. And we are working actively here in Houston to combine our scientific research, our academic research, commercial efforts. We have a ton of leaders in the business community who are really advancing in these efforts. And there really is no question that's more critical to the future of our community, but our country and our planet than how we address what folks in the industry call the dual challenge, right? Producing energy for the world while also reducing harmful emissions and battling climate change. And so to meet those objectives, we have to invest in research and development of these critical technologies. And that's what we did in our year-end appropriations bill that you mentioned. I was really glad to work on the House version of that bill, the Clean Energy Jobs and Innovation Act. But as the center of expertise and innovation in the country, I think our region is well positioned to utilize the support that's provided in that bill through those provisions for these really innovative grant programs. And also, more broadly, your question is what's the role of the oil and gas sector in being part of that solution? And I would argue it already is. What we see here, what we see happening across folks who are in the energy business here in Houston is a real forward-looking approach. And certainly we've seen over the last decade that the increase in natural gas production has led to the largest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector, and will continue to be an important part of our energy mix in reducing emissions going forward. On carbon capture, CCUS, you mentioned, that's a critical part of our path forward in meeting our energy needs and reducing emissions. And I've met with a ton of companies. We've had roundtable discussions and work here in our district to make sure that we are ready to implement carbon capture projects, waiting on a little bit of guidance from the IRS, trying to make sure that we're, utilizing all the tools available, and of course, authorizing again in legislation, in the appropriations legislation at the end of last year, the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act that I led in the House with some colleagues, my colleague Mark Vesey from Fort Worth, and others in the Congress in a bipartisan way to make sure that we are focused on that. And so, I was really, really pleased that we will see a federal investment in kind of large scale demonstration projects for carbon capture. And I think it really is just a big piece of what we're talking about in this Congress as well. But other traditional oil and gas companies in the sector are leading on other initiatives too. I know Shell has just put out a whole new framework. BP, which is here headquartered in my district, also very active in working with our city on our climate plan. There are just a lot of opportunities for leadership from people who are in the energy business. And that's why I truly believe, actually, I know that, here in Houston, we will lead in energy innovation in the present and in the years to come.
Great. Well, it's certainly an area of the country that's proven itself to be entrepreneurial and innovative, and I'm glad to hear the optimism. And I think it's well placed. So the Energy Act itself included several of your priorities, including extension of the alternative fuels tax credits, some modernized regulations, and new pilot safety plan at PHMSA, and of course you mentioned fossil energy and clean energy technology innovation, research funding in those areas. What do you see as kind of the next, specific concrete steps that we have to be taken to implement those priorities, and what can we do to help?
Well, that's a great question. I might take it in reverse order.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to help? Because I think that is something I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about, and just want to remind everybody who's participating this morning that advocacy and partnership are really the key to success here. What I have seen since I've been in Congress is that there are a whole lot of people who want to craft good policy, who want to make smart policy decisions going forward, but we need input from a lot of stakeholders and a lot of people in shaping that policy. And I think it's really important for businesses and people across the country to engage on the issues, to talk to policymakers, but also to talk to your neighbors about what you do, how you do it, why you do it, and how we can work together to achieve shared goals and to reinforce our shared values. That's, as I've said already this morning, that's certainly how we do things in Houston. We see the business community as an essential partner in our community's goals. I mentioned that BP is working on our climate action plan here in the city of Houston. But businesses have had a really important role in voicing both support for policies and also opposition. Certainly, in the last Texas legislative session, businesses across the state of Texas kind of coalesced in opposing some legislation that was important. But here we're also seeing support for these kinds of programs that you mentioned, and supporting our climate initiatives. And I think it's really important for people to understand kind of when it comes to energy, how we use it, all the diverse forms of energy that we use, what the opportunities are and the challenges in front of us, because we are really talking about so many facets of our lives when we talk about energy. Whether it's upstream, midstream, or downstream, it affects everyone across the country and around the world. And so it's really important for us to understand, and for people to understand our energy needs, and then to come together around how we meet them. So, to have good policy, we have to have good conversation, not just at a high level, but really in the weeds. So I think that that's really important. And then, in terms of what I see sort of happening in the short term, because I'm on the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Science Committee, I've been really actively involved in our early discussions. Just last week, the Energy and Commerce Committee had a hearing on the Clean Futures Act, and that implements some of the key concepts that we saw in the Energy Act last year to accelerate the deployment of clean energy technology. It covers CCUS and addresses some of the market barriers there, facilitates the integration of clean and renewable sources into the grid, which is something, of course, that's on all of our minds here in Texas after the winter storm a few weeks ago. And it provides for grants that will go to grid modernization, resilience, storage, just a lot of different technologies that we need to develop. And so I think that's really important. The other piece that I think is just worth touching on, and happy to answer more questions about it as it takes shape. But of course, we've been talking about an infrastructure package in the Congress as an opportunity to focus on relief from the pandemic, creating jobs and spurring the economy, and also to rebuild and build back better, as the president would say, but to rebuild in a modern infrastructure that both lowers carbon emissions and delivers low-cost energy to consumers, while allowing the economy to thrive and while allowing our communities to build in a more resilient way, which is another key priority for us here on the Gulf Coast after many years of hurricane after hurricane. Resilience is also really a key issue that we've been talking about in Congress ever since I arrived. And so, of course, as you mentioned, President Biden set out his vision for an infrastructure plan just yesterday. And I hope that we'll see bipartisan efforts in authorizing all kinds of projects to invest in our infrastructure, in basic science research, and our energy future.
Great. Well, thank you. And great advice on kind of next steps on what we need to do. And know that you can count on the chamber and our members to be a partner in that to help move that forward. So you mentioned both the infrastructure and the Clean Futures Act, again, important policy to move forward here. The chamber's consistently called for bipartisan action, creating a governing coalition, if you will, to create durable policy solutions. And by the way, thank you for your role in that, whether it had to do with USMCA or the innovation policy and other things as well. I guess my question is, last year on the Energy Policy Act, it was almost a model for watching bipartisan action. Again, dozens of bills in the Senate that all had bipartisan support, came together, both the House committees and the Senate committees went through regular order, and we actually had a bill enacted in that way. So I guess as now the president has put out his infrastructure proposal, Clean Future Act is out there. I mean, do you see that? Is there room to advance legislation in a bipartisan manner, similar to what we saw last year on the Energy Act?
Yeah, I think so, and I certainly hope so. The Energy Act, as you mentioned, was a combination of, I think, 14 different bills from the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, which I served on in the last Congress as well as this one. And I can tell you that that committee worked very well in a bipartisan manner on all kinds of issues, including climate issues. And I think that that's really important. The very first bill, I was a subcommittee chair in the last Congress for first the Environment Subcommittee, and then the Energy Subcommittee. And the very first bills we passed out of our Environment Subcommittee were all related to ocean acidification and climate change. And they passed not just in a bipartisan way, they passed unanimously out of our subcommittee and out of our committee. A lot of that, I think, is attributable to the leadership at the top of our committee, the dean of my Texas delegation, Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, working with Frank Lucas, the ranking member, to really have a bipartisan approach in our work. And I think the same can certainly be true. I know that when it comes to the infrastructure package, for example, The Speaker of the House has tasked all of the committee chairmen on the committees of jurisdiction to work with the ranking members in identifying shared priorities. And so I certainly hope that we will see that continued collaboration and work across the aisle. And your question touched on what I think is probably the most important point, which is we really can't afford to have these questions about energy be partisan. And I think that what we're seeing across the country, unfortunately, is a heightened, more partisan environment. And I think that it is bad for our businesses. And I think it's bad for our climate goals and our environmental goals to have this politicization of energy. I just think it's incredibly dangerous because, as you said, we need durable policy that can survive from Congress to Congress and administration to administration. And so a key part of making sure that we do that is bringing people together in a bipartisan way to work on the legislation, to work on the programs going forward, and really get behind kind of a consensus approach, acknowledging the seriousness and urgency of the moment that we are in. And certainly, as I said, here in Texas, we have seen what happens when you don't have power. We have seen, that results in loss of lives. We need to make sure that we are rebuilding our infrastructure, our energy grid, making sure that we are able to provide energy across the country. And of course, here in Houston and the United States, now we've become a net exporter. We're providing energy to the world. And we want to continue to do that. We want to continue to lead in the energy industry and lead with our values, because we know that energy produced in the United States is produced to higher environmental standards, better standards for workers. There are just so many benefits of us retaining our position as the energy leader in the world and engaging with the entire world. But we need to really work on making sure that our domestic policy and foreign policy around energy is something that we do in a bipartisan way, and that we can all agree and move forward together, because I really think that's the only way we get the kind of certainty that businesses are looking for as they are trying to make massive investments, as well as the certainty we need to know that we are on a path to achieve our climate goals and address other environmental challenges that are in front of us. So I think it's a really, really important point that you raised, and appreciate you making it. And I am hopeful, and I am certainly committed to working that way.
Well, great. I know we can count on you, and you certainly can count on us to help make that happen as well. We have been getting some questions in from the audience, some of which are very specific, but I'm going to I'll try to meld some of these together. I did want to a little bit, back on the specifics of the Energy Act and the innovation piece, and the broader idea that a lot of goals have been set out there for achieving certain emission reductions by a certain date, and ambition is great, and we want to have that ambition, but we also have to make sure that we have the technology in place to get us there. So I guess getting a little more specific to your district and in Houston, how do you see what the Energy Act envisions on all the RD&D and commercialization? What do we need to do to help the private sector both finance but then deploy, commercialize? How will those types of programs affect your district specifically?
Well, I think they're going to have a tremendous impact on my district specifically. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, I did a roundtable shortly before COVID when we were all still meeting in person. I had a dozen people in my office representing different companies that are all working on CCUS, and we talked about some of the real practical on the ground challenges and need certainly for some clarity in the 45Q regulations, which we pushed for in the last Congress. But they are ready to go as soon as they can get some clarity. And I think that where we authorize the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act, that's a huge priority for us to make that investment. And a lot of the other grant programs that you see, I mean, certainly, another thing that's really important for us is making sure that we got the pipeline safety enhancement pilot program through. We have a lot of folks in the midstream sector here in my district. I probably have the highest concentration of any member of Congress, and a lot of experience working with them over the years. So really putting together a thoughtful a thoughtful plan to develop new technologies for pipeline safety, which is, of course, of concern to people across the country. We want to make sure that our pipeline infrastructure is safe. And so this really allows us to bring forth new technologies and test them, and make sure that that we can do that in a way that is most efficient, as well as some of the other updated regulations to PHMSA that we were able to do after many, many years of working together on that. Those will be critically important here in our district. But I also point out that a lot of the other initiatives too, sometimes people don't realize that Texas is actually a leader in wind energy as well. And we have wind and solar here in Houston very actively developing. We also have a huge presence, not just on the land side for wind, but on offshore wind capabilities. There's a great synergy of some of the folks in my district who have worked offshore in traditional energy, mapping the ocean floor, who are now working on that for offshore wind projects. So a lot of the different kind of demonstration projects and investments and grant programs will have a direct benefit for the folks here in my district, who I think are best positioned to lead that research and that innovation. And so we will then be able to, I think, help everyone across the country and around the world from right here in the 7th Congressional District.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you raised that about Texas' role in many different types of energy, because this is it's exactly the, as we said, the Energy Act provided the kitchen sink approach that we need if we want to really address all of the challenges that we need to on a global scale. Let's not forget, this is not just about reducing emissions here, but allowing the U.S. to be competitive and being the leaders that we are in technology that will allow the developing world to deploy such technologies both at scale and at cost. So I think that's really important. Well, Congresswoman Fletcher, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, and we really look forward to working with you on these issues and many others. So I invite you to make any closing comments, and then we'll wrap up this part of the show.
Well, thank you so much, Marty, for inviting me and including me today. I'm delighted to be with you, and I very much look forward to working with you and your members on continuing to develop and advocate for smart, common sense policy that really brings people together. I think it's great that you're talking in depth about this really innovative and important legislation. And I am grateful for the opportunity to be with you and look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And up next, we have a panel of experts to break down the Energy Act of 2020. Welcome back. Joining me now for a roundtable is a panel of experts. First, we have Robin Milliken, who's a director at Breakthrough Energy, which was founded by Bill Gates in 2015 to focus on climate solutions. Robin leads the organization's federal policy and advocacy strategies. Rich Powell is executive director at ClearPath, the DC-based organization advancing policies that accelerate breakthrough innovations to reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. And Josh Freed of Third Way, where he's led their clean energy and climate advocacy efforts since 2009. Robin, let me start with you. The Energy Act is truly historic, but in our view, it isn't getting the attention it deserves. So why is the bill and the broader issue of technological solutions to climate change so important? So at both a high level and perhaps more granular, what is it in the bill that people should know about from your perspective?
Well, thanks, Marty. First of all, I'm really glad to be here with you all today at an especially timely moment, given everything that's happening this week. As you noted in your introduction, Marty, the need for energy innovation is a core and central part of the work that we do at Breakthrough Energy. And that is evidenced by the quote that you showed during the transition from our founder, Bill Gates. We're really excited that we're at a moment, right, where in the last few years, many different communities with different views have really come together around a shared agenda and vision for the future. And to me, the bottom line is that this is an issue that unites us, right? Because we know it's essential to preserving our environment, it's essential to growing our economy, and we need it to maintain our ability to compete globally. We also know that we really need to act quickly and with speed. For example, a recent International Energy Agency study found that half of the technologies needed to reduce US emissions, especially in the transport and industrial sectors, are at the pre-commercial phase. So to us, the next decade is really the critical window to go big on research, development, and demonstration, and to go deep in areas like steel and cement. And looking at what's needed, we really think that this is going to be an all-hands effort. For our part, Breakthrough Energy is working to bring together the private and philanthropic partners that we know will need to accelerate innovation in these critical areas. But federal leadership and investment is really going to be key to bringing all of those pieces together. The fact remains, as you know, that energy is a highly regulated and risk-averse industry, and there's no natural market for low-carbon products. So we really need federal partnership to make sure that industry has the tools as well as the incentives that it needs in order to make it happen. So fortunately, as you referenced, we've seen some really big action and momentum at the federal level in recent years, where the contours of a national innovation strategy are really starting to come together. The topic of the session, of course, today is to talk about the Energy Act, which was the largest climate and energy bill to pass in nearly 15 years. And it's remarkable that that bill passed with broad bipartisan support, as Congresswoman Fletcher mentioned earlier. That legislation authorizes, among several highlights, new demonstration programs, for example, which will really be critical to bringing in the private sector to help commercialize technology. And it also fills gaps that we know we have in the RD&D space, like authorizing a new industrial cross-cutting program at DOE. So to us, where do we go from here? We really think in order to realize the promise of that bill, we need Congress to start funding innovation programs at their new authorized levels. And that, in the context of recovery, will include getting job-creating clean energy projects off the ground. At the same time, though, we think that we really need to start skating where the puck is going. So that, to us, means raising our ambition on investment, formalizing a more official national innovation strategy, and also getting more serious about how we can expand the innovation economy to more places beyond just the coast and the tech hubs. So much more work remains to be done here, but I'm really encouraged that we're at a point where we have the foundation and tools to be successful. So really looking forward to the discussion today, and thanks for having me.
You bet. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. So, Rich, a similar question for ClearPath. What's the most important thing people should know from the Energy Act?
Well, first, thanks, Marty. Thank you hugely to the Chamber for all of your work and advocacy on this incredibly important bill. I remember working with the Energy Institute, I believe actually in your former name, back as early as 2016 and trying to get something like this passed. It's been a long journey, but I'm really glad that we're here talking about the victory and talking about implementation. And also a huge thanks to our good friends and colleagues at Breakthrough and at Third Way, who we worked with so closely to get this bill done. And just a quick moment of context for folks that aren't energy nerds like us following all this as closely. At this point, we have 18 investor-owned utilities in the US that have all made net zero emissions commitments. And they virtually all said that they can get a long way with the technologies they have today, wind, solar, efficiency, et cetera, but that they're going to rely on a bunch of 24/7, 365 flexible, clean technologies that don't exist today at commercial scale if they actually want to get all the way to net zero. Now, there are only 5 really likely candidates for those technologies. We can capture the carbon emissions from coal and gas-fired power plants. We can have advanced nuclear reactors. We can do enhanced geothermal that can be sited anywhere. We can have really long duration storage systems. And we can also have kind of net emissions. So we can have technologies that pull the emissions back out to get to that net zero kind of a goal. And the Energy Act sets up a program to demonstrate those technologies on a really aggressive timeline. That aggressive timeline is really important. So if we want to hit net zero emissions by 2050, we've got to be able to build all these things in the 2030s and the 2040s. And that means we've got to demonstrate them in the 2020s so that we can actually have confidence and capture the financing to get them at commercial scale. So the demonstration program that's set up in the Energy Act is a huge one. It covers those 5 areas. It sets up advanced nuclear demonstrations with 2 commercial scale advanced reactors, building on the advanced reactor demonstration program by 2027. It sets up 6 carbon capture demonstrations on coal, on gas, and on industrial emissions. It requires demonstrations of long duration storage technologies, enhanced geothermal projects, and it even sets up a sort of an X Prize sort of concept for direct air capture technologies that pull the CO2 back out of the air. Altogether, this is really meaningful. It's more than 20 commercial scale demonstrations by the middle of this decade. It's by far the largest and most aggressive program that DOE would ever have taken on in this space. Significantly on the politics, it sort of gets us past the conversation about basic versus applied research and whether we ought to have partnerships with the private sector. There's just a big bipartisan recommitment to that approach. And I think it's also important to remember that these technologies, while they're in some sense power sector focused, they go well beyond the power sector and their applicability. So the carbon capture technologies will be really useful in industry. The sources of clean heat like advanced nuclear or hydrogen will be really important to decarbonizing transportation fuels over time. The carbon dioxide removal technologies will be useful for everything. But as Robin said, as Marty said, as the Congresswoman said, we're only at the beginning. Implementation is next. We need strong appropriations. We need strong transparency at DOE. We need strong oversight from Congress, and we need really strong private sector partners to work with DOE to get these demonstrations done.
Excellent. Thanks, Rich. That's very helpful. So Josh, again, similar. What do you see as the most important aspect of the bill and the path from here?
Yeah, and thank you, Marty, and the Chamber for inviting me to speak as part of this really excellent panel, and also for the leadership that the Chamber has had, particularly on energy innovation for the last several years, well over a decade now. It's critically important. I think one point that you made about the Energy Act not getting the attention that it should deserve, I think there's actually a benefit to it being more quiet policy. The innovation programs authorized in the Energy Act will be very important to meeting emissions targets, but there are a number of non-climate reasons to support innovation. As the various bills that formed the backbone of Energy Act made their way through committee, you heard Democrats and Republicans making arguments about the competitiveness issue, workforce, the national security merits of specific programs, and the overwhelming bulk of these Energy Act components got bipartisan support. And part of this is because even as President Biden pointed out yesterday in his speech around the American Jobs Plan, decades ago, the United States spent about 2% of its GDP, its gross domestic product, on R&D. And we spend today about 0.7%. And we're one of the few major economies that has a public investment that's declined. And that really hurts our competitiveness, our ability to create jobs, our support for industry. And a key point that the Congresswoman and both Rich and Robin made that I just think needs to be emphasized again is that these are just authorizations. The Energy Act programs and their objectives, the activities that they fund and their responsibilities, they're spelled out, but they need to be funded. And there's a real opportunity here for Republicans and Democrats who either can talk about climate as part of the reason to support this or not, to speak very clearly about the importance of competitiveness and innovation by supporting this in terms of appropriations. And a couple of other just quick points. One is, we have seen now across 3 administrations and Democratic and Republican Congress, real incremental increases in the Department of Energy innovation programs, despite, in some cases, the Trump White House's annual proposal to slash DOE's budget. And with Republican Congresses, we were able to see that funding continue to increase. We need to do even better now. And we're talking over time the need for a multi-billion-dollar increase to the DOE innovation budget that the Energy Act really is a down payment on. And it's important to have industry support backing these investments as well, and to acknowledge the role of the federal government as a partner in reducing the cost of new technologies, keeping businesses competitive in a changing economy, and really ensuring that the jobs are spread out across the country and different people in different places have access to these jobs, have access to innovation, as we're seeing a significant change in the economy, in the energy produced and the energy consumed. And one particular component of the Energy Act that Rich alluded to that we're very excited about is the support for the demonstration of advanced nuclear reactors and the development of a supply chain to support their deployment. The Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program was launched in 2020, and known as ARDP, it's issued 7 awards to U.S. nuclear reactor companies to build and operate 2 reactors, to develop the fuel around it, and to build up the supply chain. And we think that's incredibly critical, not only for developing power in the United States and potentially process heat for industry, but also to compete with other countries around the world. Both China and Russia are aggressively developing advanced nuclear technologies and creating the entire financing package, supply chain, and support for other countries to use them. And if the United States does not invest in the same way and provide the same sort of resources to other countries, we're going to find ourselves very much behind in what we believe is a critical emerging technology for addressing climate change and for powering a significant array of demands as countries look to have zero emissions electricity, zero emissions heat. And it would be as challenging for us in terms of the economy and in terms of national security as it would for climate if we fail to continue to lean into and move forward with these kinds of bipartisan proposals that the Energy Act had.
Wonderful. Thanks, Josh. That's all very helpful. So, Robin, let me ask you, as you noted, Breakthrough has been very supportive of federal investment and innovation, as also important to economic growth. Yeah, there are some critics that will say that it take a more narrow view, that it's just funding going to highly skilled researchers and scientists in existing tech hubs. Therefore, it's not all that helpful to the average American, if you will. So, just give opportunity. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Marty. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, we take a more expansive view of how innovation is beneficial to the economy. We actually did a study in 2020 with PricewaterhouseCoopers to look at what is the current impact of federally funded research and development that's going out the door today. And that study found that for roughly $130 billion in total federal R&D investment, that investment is supporting over 1.6 million jobs nationwide. And those jobs are not just highly skilled, highly compensated researchers and scientists. They also include lab technicians, maintenance staff, vendors, restaurant workers. So, it really is a broad-based economy. They also found in the study that for every direct job that is supported through federal funding, almost 3 additional jobs are created in the economy. And these are jobs that are in every state in the country. So we really do think, there is an immediate and direct impact from federally funded R&D. But it's important to note that, this study is actually a fairly conservative snapshot of overall impact, because it doesn't capture things like follow-on, investment in the private sector or patents and invention that are generated by investment. There was a really interesting study that came out recently in a peer-reviewed journal that found that almost 1/3 of all U.S. patents, basically, the ideas and knowledge of the country rely on underlying federally funded research. So we think there's a big opportunity in the energy space to grow this impact. We think, we've got a great network to build on through the national labs. But we do need, things like more research centers in more places. As Josh mentioned, we really want to make sure that all communities, especially fossil fuel communities in transition or underserved communities, can benefit from innovation. So we hope this is an area that Congress will take a serious look this year.
Thank you. And Josh, kind of staying on that theme, obviously Third Way has done a great deal of work on links between clean energy policies and job creation. And you made a strong case for those linkages. So, anything you wanted to add on that front?
Yeah, I mean, look, Robin did a great job with capturing the link between investment and innovation and the breadth of jobs that are created, and having it oriented to being place-based as well as technology-based. I think the Energy Act does a good job with that because of the diversity of technologies that it funds and the broad support that we got from Congress, so that it isn't oriented towards the traditional locations in Silicon Valley, in Austin, Texas, as much as we love those locations in Seattle, but also identifies the types of technologies, advanced nuclear, carbon capture are two examples that can be developed in traditionally fossil fuel oriented communities, also in a lot of the frontline and communities of color that too often find themselves only with energy sector development if it is fossil fuel, or not even fossil fuel, but just polluting technologies. And we need to create more opportunities there as well. One thing I'll just highlight from the American Jobs Plan that we're particularly excited about that builds on the Energy Act is looking at hydrogen hubs. And it's really important to the United States that we develop and invest in a hydrogen economy for a whole variety of opportunities, including using natural gas as a feedstock, as well as potentially other sources. And the Jobs Plan has several hydrogen hubs across the country, including in places that are not traditionally thought of as centers of innovation. Eastern Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, the Gulf Coast, which obviously is innovative in a number of other ways, but really could also become a critical part of the 21st century energy as well.
Great, thank you. So Rich, let me ask you. You did a great job of laying out the breadth of different programs from the Energy Act and the demonstration programs as well. So a lot of those to consider. Are there any, or are there particular sleeper issues that you think deserve more attention? There's broad support for a lot of this bill. So how do we keep the momentum going? But are there any kind of sleeper issues in there?
Well, I mean, a sleeper issue, and I'll just come back to this point we've all made, is that again, the authorization is only the beginning of the journey. In some cases, trains have already left the station even before the bill was passed. As Josh noted, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program was actually funded by Congress in 2020. So that program has already begun, and the initial awardees were announced and picked last year, even before this. In the other cases, we need all of those programs to be starting up really this year. In this appropriation cycle, we need those resources dedicated. We need specific demonstration programs initiated for each of those different other technologies, grid scale storage, carbon capture demonstrations, geothermal demonstrations, the direct air capture demonstrations and X prizes. That all needs to happen this year. That's a non-trivial challenge. For better or for worse, demonstration programs are major, expensive programs, even if they're really well directed and with really strong cost shares from the private sector. So getting just all of the focus this year on setting up and establishing those programs to make sure that we start those in as strong a way as we've started the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program this last year. So part of that will have to be just about enlarging the pie at the Department of Energy and getting a really robust allocation into the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill, getting really robust allocation into the Department of Energy so that they can do this. And part of it, frankly, may have to be some tough choices in DOE. We think at this point, these demonstration programs are the highest priority at DOE, and there are probably areas that need to be reallocated within the DOE program in order to make way for these next generation technologies. So that's going to be a big and complicated issue as we work through the fiscal year 2020 appropriations process this year. And I hope that everyone who's listening in, who either as an individual or as a company perhaps engages in that process, will put their shoulder to the wheel and help encourage particularly congressional appropriators to be very focused on that.
Great, that's very helpful. I'm going to turn to questions we've been getting from the audience now. So I'll start. Robin, we had a question. Said you mentioned the private sector, the need for the private sector, to help fill in the gap. So what can business do to take steps to do that? I think you're on mute.
It was bound to happen at some point. Well, thanks for the question. As I mentioned during my remarks earlier, we are doing a lot of work at Breakthrough Energy with the private sector. And we think they're going to be key in ensuring that new technologies can be brought to scale because they have the expertise, the infrastructure, and the resources needed to commercialize technology. And of course, they are actually providing services to customers. So, our perspective is, look, we definitely need more courage and commitment from the private sector. But nonetheless, we can't expect them to just go it alone because, as I mentioned earlier, the energy sector, for good reason, is highly regulated, highly risk averse. You don't want to plug something in and have it, blow up the grid. And on top of that, there's no natural market for low carbon products. So, outside voluntary corporate commitments or public policy, we really don't have, sort of natural incentives for them to invest. So what that means to us is, yes, we need more, courage and commitment from the private sector. We're working on that. But in tandem, we need research and development as well as market shaping policy to ensure that the private sector has the tools and incentives that they need to bring technology to scale. Similarly, we think there is a role for philanthropy as well because, we need lots of non-dilutive capital, for example, going into incubators and accelerators and startups. So, we hope to see more action and activity there as well.
Great, thank you, Robin. Rich, you raised the direct air capture. I got a question from the audience. Just to you could tell us a little bit more about how you think that technology will fit in, can fit in, needs to fit in.
Sure. Yep. Well, so just to take a big step back, folks should remember when they hear a net zero goal from a company, whether that's an electric utility or an oil and gas company, they're saying that in the future, the amount of emissions that they have will either be zero or will be netted out, meaning that they'll procure offsets or direct air capture or something else that pulls any CO2 that they're still emitting in the future back out of the air. And this is really important for a couple of reasons. It may well be that that's the most economical thing to do in the future. We should all remember, unmitigated fossil fuels are a really useful technology. And for some applications, think like home heating, the ranges that we use to cook our food or the boilers to heat our water. In some applications, it's really difficult to replace unmitigated fossil fuels. So there may be some applications that even in 2050, we still want to be using some limited amount of this without any carbon capture. And if we can find some way to, equivalently capture that CO2 back out of the air, that's okay, right, from a climate perspective. And even more importantly, thinking long term, it may well be that we don't slow down emissions as quickly as we all would like, and we may need a large scale program around the world that pulls a lot of CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Think sort of like a waste removal program for the planet that a lot of companies might decide to fund in the future. That's all pretty far off, but the technology to do that is in its infancy today. Estimates really range of how much that costs today. Probably to do the direct air capture using machines, it's probably in the neighborhood of $400 to $800 a ton to do that right now. That's pretty expensive, right? We're not going to be able to do that at gigantic scale if it's that much. That said, the way to make it cheaper is to deploy more of it, to learn by doing, to bring the costs down, to experiment with new approaches, to find ways to do kind of hybrid carbon dioxide removal, perhaps using biological systems to capture a lot of the CO2 from the air and then doing something with all that biological material, like transforming it so it can be stored back underground permanently and quantifiably. So there's a lot there. We're in the early stages. There's been a number of big voluntary corporate programs, probably most notably at Microsoft, who have said, that they're not just going to go to net zero emissions. They're actually going to pull back out of the atmosphere all the CO2 that their operations have ever emitted, and that's a pretty cool, pretty wild commitment, and they've committed to sort of putting at least $1 billion into that effort. So we're starting to see some voluntary progress on that, but we're still a long way off from having a big portfolio of really affordable technologies that can do that permanently and controllably and really quantifiably to pull that CO2 back out of the air. And so the programs that were begun here, which are a legacy of legislation that Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, who's a big enthusiast of sort of prize-based approaches to incenting new technology, it ended up in the energy bill, sort of a legacy of the Use It Act. And so now we actually are going to have two different programs, one at the Department of Energy, one at the Environmental Protection Agency, that are both going to be attempting to set up prizes or procurements for this kind of technology to get this whole process started.
Great, thanks, Rich. Josh, I'm going to throw two quick questions at you here. The questions both about identifying priority projects to improve advanced nuclear energy infrastructure, but also you touched on hydrogen, and so there was an interest in getting some more, hearing more about hydrogen, natural gas as a feedstock, and obviously will require U.S. natural gas, to do that. So the pipeline infrastructure and all the rest. So again, if you wouldn't mind kind of grabbing those two issues.
Sure. Look, first on the advanced nuclear front, we are well on the way thanks to real deep, enduring bipartisan support to demonstrating multiple advanced nuclear reactors before the end of this decade. We've got two that have been awarded significant grants and cost shares from the Department of Energy, with the goal of having them completed and starting to put electrons onto the grid by 2027, and multiple more that have received initial research grants with the expectation that they'll start to be built and then demonstrated by the middle at the latest of the next decade. As part of that, there's also research and investment going into the development of and making sure that there's domestic availability of what's known as high SA, low enriched uranium, which is the fuel that many, but not all of the advanced nuclear reactors will need, and making sure that we've got a durable, long supply of that, and that we're looking at what the supply chain eventually will be as these reactors begin to get scaled up, and there's wide interest potentially across both domestic utilities, industry, and potentially the export of them. So it's still in the early stages, but one of the things that I think is really exciting about how the government and the private sector jointly have been approaching this is thinking about the full cycle of what it will take to develop, deploy, commercialize, and employ a number of Americans across the country in an advanced nuclear industry that we think could be both very robust and a critical part of reducing emissions. Hydrogen, we're a little earlier in the development of that. The initial research projects into the production of hydrogen from a number of feedstocks and then using it both potentially for long haul trucking as an alternative to electric long haul trucks, as well as a feedstock for industrial processes are just starting. There are a number of research projects looking at what are the ways, particularly to use natural gas with carbon capture on it as a feedstock, as well as what would the pipeline requirements be for both getting the natural gas to the facilities and also for shipping hydrogen once it's produced and it has a number of applications for it. And look, I think one of the things that we've talked about, Robin in particular alluded to, that becomes really interesting with hydrogen is the broad array of skills that are required as we build out, hopefully, part of our hydrogen economy. in addition to the researchers and engineers and scientists, it's going to require a lot of pipe fitters. It's going to require a lot of the kind of well-paid, organized, but blue-collar workers that are currently in the oil and gas industry and other industries and looking for additional or new opportunities. So the Biden administration has already really leaned into this. It has bipartisan support in Congress. It's one of those examples, both in the Energy Act, but hopefully in this Congress, of the kind of action that we should be able to get through, regardless of partisan tensions in other areas.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Well, listen, we're kind of coming to the end here. Rich, I know ClearPath has done a lot of great work on hydrogen as well. And I think from our conversation around from this panel, we see that, we covered a lot of different areas, a lot of different technologies. And this was just our kickoff conversation to talk about how do we get this funded, right? So, but I'm excited that we've got a lot more to dig into on each of these specific technologies. And we're going to try to do these on about a 3-week cadence where we can get more into carbon capture and removal and advanced nuclear and the hydrogen economy and traditional fuels and also other policy needs like permitting that are going to be critical for whatever we want to build. So I can't thank the three of you enough for joining us today and really adding to the conversation. And I'd like to thank all of those who joined us, our audience today. With great participation, appreciate the questions, and we know that conversations like these are going to be crucial, to getting these technologies funded. We all know, and we've seen. I think I can speak for everyone on the panel here that with all of these different ambitious goals that have been laid out there, we know we're going to need technology and innovation for us to achieve those goals. So we hope you'll plan to join us for our next session, which is scheduled for April 22nd, where, as I noted, we'll be discussing carbon capture, storage, and carbon removal. And you can find the registration link in the chat box here today. So thank you all very much, and look forward to the next episode.